Hello there and a very good day to you. Welcome to another episode of the People's Platform. For the News First team, I'm Jayamal Ratnayaka, and today we will be discussing a very pertinent topic as always, and a topic that has surfaced and remained in the public sphere for many a time in Sri Lanka, and a topic that has been addressed, however, to no avail. And we are here to talk about this topic with someone who is very vocal in that sphere. She is a former commissioner of the Sri Lanka Human Rights Commission and also an advocate of human rights. She is none other than Ambika Satgurunathan. Thank you very much, Ambika, for joining me this evening.
Thank you for having me on the show.
Certainly. Ambika, on the outset, let's give our viewers a brief introduction about what we're talking about today. The war on drugs is a term that has been thrown around quite a lot, especially over the past few years. We saw during then President Gotabaya Rajapaksa's tenure, the war on drugs was highly debated and also highlighted as also in his manifesto. And he also put forth a presidential commission, I believe, or a task force. Yes, to create a virtuous society, which included certain aspects of combating drug use, drug abuse, and so on. So today we are here to talk about a report that you have compiled called A Broken System, that is drug control, detention, and treatment of people who use drugs in Sri Lanka. We will, of course, delve deeper into this and much more relating to drug use in Sri Lanka. But to give us an entrance to this topic, Ambika, is the war on drugs the ideal term to define drug use in Sri Lanka?
The war on drugs, good question to start with. The war on drugs is a term that is not being used for the first time only in Sri Lanka. We've seen the war on drugs in other parts of the world, in South America, in the United States, for instance.
Exactly.
And most often, these wars have had disastrous consequences and have not resolved the problem. So we have to ask why. It is because these wars tend to be militarized, even in other parts of the world. And when you militarize something, you put the people who are dealing with the issue really do not have the expertise to be dealing with it.
Yes.
You use violence to cope with the issue, to address it. And you also target not the root causes of the problem, you're targeting most often the poor, the marginalized. So you target people who use drugs. And if you look at the demographic, particularly in Sri Lanka, the people who use drugs tend to come, or the people who use drugs and end up in police stations and or prisons tend to come from the poor, from the marginalized society. They are caught because they are in possession of a very small quantity of drugs, and then they're sent to prison. Already their lives are quite complex and broken, and going to prison only exacerbates the problem. So when they are released from prison, they also have no support, which means they will once again start to use, or they that are already discriminated against, that are poor. And so therefore the term really is not, because you are waging war against who, what? Most often it is against your own people, like many other wars in our context too.
So, speaking on the war on drugs, we've seen how this combat has been, or this war has been involving the military. It has been militarized, and former President Gotabaya Rajapaksa also formalized this military intervention in combating drug use. Is the military's intervention really necessary when the primary authority to control drugs is the police, and when you have a specialized unit of the Police Narcotics Bureau? Does the military really have to intervene to quell this matter?
Well, that's a pertinent question to ask, not just in relation to drugs in Sri Lanka, but in relation to so many things in Sri Lanka, because the military is involved in policing, just general policing. Now, the new anti-terrorism bill actually brings the military in. It gives the military the power to arrest, detain, etc. The military is involved in running businesses. So this is just one aspect of militarization, the militarization of drug control and detention. Bringing the military in is a bad idea because, as I keep repeatedly saying, the role of a military in a healthy, functioning democracy is the securing of your external borders. They are not supposed to get involved in policing because their response is always, using force is their first response. It's not used as a last resort.
Yes.
They do not know how to de-escalate a situation. They are not trained in policing, in looking at what is best for the community at that time and responding to it. So I would say bringing the military in is a bad idea, and it's not just in relation to assisting in conducting raids or going to schools and conducting programs on drug awareness. It's also involvement in treatment. Now, drug dependency, someone starts using drugs, becomes dependent on that. It is a health issue.
Right.
It needs to be treated as a health issue, and health professionals have to be involved in it. You cannot have the police or military getting involved in drug treatment because it requires medical intervention, it requires specialist knowledge. But what is happening in Sri Lanka is that we have Kandakadu, which is quite notorious because if you go out on the streets or you go to prison and you speak to young people who maybe have knowledge of drugs, who've tried drugs or used drugs, Kandakadu everyone knows. And they are petrified of it because they know that the military runs it. And there is violence. From the point of entry to point of exit, there is violence, and violence is normalized. Now, if you look at the legal structure, because it's important, the military is nowhere to be found. Now, what do I mean by that? The Kandakadu comes under the Commissioner General for Rehabilitation. Commissioner General for Rehabilitation comes within the purview of the State Ministry of Prisons. Now, the State Ministry of Prisons comes under the purview of the Ministry of Justice. Now, in this structure, do you see the military anywhere? No. So the military is involved, has a lot of power, is running the center, but legally cannot be held accountable because legally you cannot find it anywhere. So if something goes wrong, we would go to the Commissioner General or the Ministry of Prisons or the Ministry of Justice. You can't go to the commander of the military because he'd just say, I'm sorry, where do you see us? What is our role? We are not responsible. They can very easily say that. So they are involved in this. They run the centers. And there is no medical treatment or intervention. It is through abstinence. So basically, even when you're going through severe withdrawal symptoms that will have physical and psychological impact, you are not given any medication. There is no doctor overseeing your well-being. And even when you're going through withdrawal symptoms, you are forced to take part in activities. You are forced to go and work in the garden. Now, this can actually have severe physical ramifications. Someone could possibly have even a cardiac arrest and collapse. And if that happens, then who's responsible? Now, we saw in June of 2022 an incident in Kandakadu where they allegedly, the military assaulted someone, leading to the person's death, which then led to kind of an internal chaos there, people escaping from the center. And I think everyone would have seen videos of people saying how they're begging them to be sent to prison because they said the condition was so bad at Kandakar. So you can imagine how bad it was. And not just that, I think 3 officers, 1 Army and 2 Air Force, I think, officers were arrested for the murder of this man. So therefore, involving the military is really not a good idea. But what is even worse is even after all this, there was another incident in November 2022, similar. There was no death, but once again, there was conflict, commotion inside, and it led to several people escaping. They were thereafter arrested, and some were sent to prison. They were remanded. Now, all this shows that the military really doesn't have if there is conflict between 2 groups, experts, if you're an expert, you should be able to de-escalate. you should be able to prevent conflict in the first place. If not, you should be able to de-escalate.
Yes.
Both times what we saw is escalation. Violence, people escaping. So what on earth should they be involved in this? What is most disturbing is that even after all this, they seem to be still running the center. So you have to ask, does the government actually care about the rule of law, legality? They keep passing laws, but they also are doing things that are completely outside the legal framework.
So, talking about the legal framework and the shortcomings in the law and also in practice when it comes to treatment of persons who are arrested for drug-related offences, we have seen several suspects or victims claiming that they have been framed or drugs have been planted. Certain women in particular have claimed that they felt like their privacy was invaded through body searches and so on. So how do you rectify this situation both in law and also in practice, Ambika?
Yes, and while I was at the Human Rights Commission, we received many complaints of people claiming that drugs were planted on them. And even after I left the commission, when I was doing research for this and other research, continuing research, once again, that's a very common complaint.
Yeah.
Now, it's not just, I'm not the only one person saying this. There's a retired DIG who's also said this quite openly, a recently retired DIG. I think he's also been on media and said this. And if I remember, didn't the Minister of Justice also a few weeks ago say something similar, that drugs are planted, that much of the drugs sent for examination to the government analysts for testing, they're like, not even drugs, that there are other substances that have been mixed in that, etc. So even the Minister of Justice seems to accept that
and
be aware and accept that the law enforcement is corrupt, that it is dysfunctional, that they do illegal, they are engaged in illegal action, illegal acts. And therefore, I think it is time for us to do something about policing in general, not just in relation to drugs, but the institution of the police, which is severely dysfunctional, where violence is normal. To them, violence is normal. It is not something, and the reason they think violence is normal is because they are able to use violence and they're never held accountable. They know they can get away scot-free, not just in this. Even in relation to, violence against protesters, abusing someone who has been arrested. Where laws are concerned, we find that, there are many laws, and the laws in Sri Lanka are also contradictory. I'll give you an example. We have a law from 2007 that's called the Drug Dependence Rehabilitation and Treatment Act.
Right.
Now, that gives the police unbelievable powers. Now, if the police just receives information that, let's say, Ambika, someone phones the police station and says, Ambika is a habitual user of drugs and she's drug dependent. The policeman runs over to my house, arrests me, and can produce me before a government medical officer to obtain a report. Now, we have to remember that globally, there is no test that can determine that a person is drug dependent. The only way to decide that is if the person himself or herself acknowledges they're drug dependent. You need to have a social worker, you need to have a psychiatrist, and between them you need to have a drug and alcohol counselor. And the person, based on the information the person provides, they make a decision whether the person is drug dependent or not. In order for them to make the decision, the person has to tell them the truth about the kind of drug they use, how long they've been using, how they use it, etc. Which means a person has to tell the truth. You cannot force it out of the person.
Exactly.
Now, a medical test, if you do like a blood test, a urine test, some sort of a toxicology test, what that will show is that the presence of drugs in your body at the moment. So the person could have tried drugs for the first time, not drug dependent, but they could drag the person off. The other thing to remember is that most of the time they don't even, now when they produce a person before the government medical officer, they don't do any of these tests. I just spoke to a few people who had gone just a few days ago, and I asked, so did they do a blood test, a urine test, whatnot? No. They just talk to the person and decide the person is drug dependent. So let's say someone talks to me, decides I'm drug dependent, and they give the report to the police. The police then, with the report, produces me before the magistrate. Magistrate looks at the report, Ambika is drug dependent. What does the magistrate do? Order me to compulsory rehabilitation. It can be up to 1 year. Now so this law says that, but now that is very problematic because it gives the police a lot of power. Based on just random information, they can arrest someone, they produce the person before the judge, and while the GMO, the government medical officer, examines you and until the report comes, you probably will be remanded and in prison. Once a report comes, then you're produced before the magistrates, and they send you off on this report, which is not based on a proper test, off to rehabilitation, where you could possibly be subjected to violence. Now, that is one law. Now, last year they amended. Now, once again, they amended in Sri Lanka, we have a main law called the Poisons, Opium and Dangerous Drugs Ordinance. That is the law that has all the offences related to drugs.
Right.
Now, last year, the government amended that. Now, most people did not notice it, and no one, not even any of the usual suspects who raised their voices against such things, they did not. And I think one of that is also due to the fact that it's related to persons who use drugs. It's because it's related to drugs that most of society does not care.
They turn a blind eye.
They turn a blind eye because they think, oh, these are horrible people. These people deserve it. We don't care what the government does. But the danger is, if you let the government violate the rights of one group of people, believe me, they're going to come for you very soon. And we have seen that just in the last year, how that has panned out. So here what happens is, so they amended it. And they've got a section which actually is worse, which says that the policeman can produce you before a government medical officer, and based on the report, the officer in charge, without producing you before a magistrate, the officer in charge of the police station can refer you to a drug rehab center. Do you want that? Do you want an officer in charge of a police station, an OIC, to have the power to decide whether or not and where you should go for rehabilitation or treatment? That is unbelievable, but also contradicts, right? 2007 law says, yes, the policeman has to do that and produce you before a magistrate. This law says, no, no need to produce before a magistrate. You can directly. So these laws are contradictory, which brings us also to the point where how are laws drafted in Sri Lanka? What is the process? Do you take a look at, assess all the laws, the gaps, and make sure that they are not in contradiction? What is the public consultation? Now, before they drafted these laws, particularly the recent amendment, did they speak with human rights activists? Did they speak with medical personnel? Did they speak with... Clearly they didn't. Because if they had, the advice given would have been, please do not do this because this is not solving the problem. This is only going to give the police excessive powers, which they will abuse, all the while you're not treating the problem itself. If a person is drug dependent, there are certain things that we can discuss that later, how you could approach the problem. So I would say in practice and in law, these are some of the things. We need to review the laws that we have.
Yes.
And some of these, like the 2007 Act, need to be repealed because you cannot send anyone to compulsory drug rehabilitation.
Right.
Because there is a lot of evidence that says it does not work. You can't force people, right? You can't. They have to, and they say even where it's alcohol or any other sort of dependency, they say you need to first acknowledge it and you need to seek treatment and seek help. Secondly, it violates human rights standards. Globally, there is also statements issued by the UN, which says that all governments, they've called upon all countries to shut down these compulsory drug treatment centers and move towards voluntary treatment. So there is a lot that can be done, but it appears the government is not interested in listening to expertise, listening to reason, and instead is taking a very populist but regressive approach that is only going to exacerbate the problem.
Right. So we are in conversation with Ambika Sadgunanathan on drug control and prevention in Sri Lanka. We will be diving deeper into this problem, but we need to head into a short commercial break. Stay with us. We will be right back.
How important is it to bring about new legislation?
We are talking about problems at massive levels.
People have a question mark over the governance.
The other bill we have is the Women Empowerment Bill.
The People's Platform every Monday and Friday at 7:30 p.m. on
ශ්‍රී ලංකා සතියේ දිනවල උදෑසන 7ට.
What they fail to do is to present a proper roadmap to the people.
Spend this amount of money for this selection.
Greater clarity and greater information makes politicians' life also easy.
The leader of the party was there. Why are you getting agitated? Why are you getting agitated?
The true meaning of democracy.
Face the Nation every Wednesday at 9:30 p.m. on TV1.
Welcome back to the People's Platform. Today we are talking about drug control and drug prevention in Sri Lanka with Ambika Sadgunanathan. Ambika, before the break, we spoke about the legal approach here in Sri Lanka. I want to talk to you about the international legal framework, as you've also mentioned in the report. It says international human rights instruments promote a human rights-based public health approach to drug treatment. And it also goes to say that Sri Lanka is a party to 3 key international drug control conventions: the Single Convention on Narcotic Drugs of 1961, the Convention on Psychotropic Substances of 1971, and the 1988 United Nations Convention against Illicit Trafficking in Narcotic Drugs and Psychotropic Substances. So, if Sri Lanka is in fact a party to all of these conventions in terms of drug prevention and drug control, how successful has Sri Lanka been in upholding these standards, these international standards?
Firstly, what many countries do is that they show, it's quite similar to counterterrorism actually, because countries point to these drug control conventions they're part of, like countries point to the anti-terrorism conventions they're part of, and they say, oh, it's because of these international conventions that place duties upon us, that we have to take all these regressive, repressive, anti-human rights actions and pass all these laws. Absolute lie. They're being disingenuous, because all these conventions within the UN system, all these conventions are subject to the human rights treaties.
Right.
You cannot implement these conventions in a way that violates human rights.
Right.
That is a basic. The other thing is that now if you take these conventions, there are also other conventions. Now if you're talking about drug treatment, the UN Special Rapporteur on Torture has said that abstinence-based treatment, that is, if someone wants to stop using drugs has a drug dependency, wants to stop using drugs,
Yes.
instead of providing them medical assistance, let's say to deal with withdrawal, what they do is they say, oh, quit cold turkey. So you have to go through the withdrawal symptoms without any medical assistance, which means it will have severe, terrible impact on you physically. You will have body aches, you might not be able to sleep, you'll be nauseous, you'll have fever, I mean, just terrible. And even psychological, right? So the Special Rapporteur on Torture has said that this can constitute torture. This kind of subjecting them to forced abstinence can constitute torture because it is torturous, right? And so that is one thing. The other thing is, of course, compulsory drug treatment, which is also against human rights because adults have a right to consent to treatment and they have the right to withdraw their consent at any time.
Yes.
Now, when you send people to Kandakadu for compulsory drug treatment for up to 1 year, you are denying them that right. And they are when they go, it's abstinence-based, so they are being subjected to torture in the fact that they are not given any medical assistance to deal with the withdrawal symptoms. And also, in addition to that, they're also being subjected to violence by the people who run that center. So you can see at how many points there are human rights violations. Now, as I said, one of the in the Sri Lanka, instead of adopting a health and human rights based approach, what they have done through even the recent laws, right? Because we had another law, we're talking about laws, yet another law in January called the Bureau of Rehabilitation Act. Now, once again, when it was first presented, there was a lot of uproar because they thought it would apply to a large group of people. It can apply to even protesters, dissenters. But once they made amendments to that to make it apply only to persons, who are drug dependent, everyone lost interest. No one said a thing. And the law actually came into effect on the 24th of January of 2023. What most people seem to have missed is there is a clause in that which says, or any other person, which means that law can be used against you or I. We can, right? So that law now, for instance, it's like a whole web. Now, that Bureau of Rehabilitation Act can be used in conjunction with this new Anti-Terrorism Act.
Bill,
because in that new anti-terrorism law that they're proposing, the bill, it says that the Attorney General can suspend or stop prosecution against a person or not even initiate criminal proceedings if the act that the person has committed has not caused death and has not endangered the national security of Sri Lanka.
Right.
There are certain conditions. If the person fulfills those conditions, then they won't start legal proceedings against.
Okay.
And one of those conditions is about giving a public apology, it's about giving compensation, various things. One of the things there is if the person voluntarily goes for rehabilitation. Firstly, don't you think there's a contradiction there? Because you can't tell a person you have to voluntarily go because that immediately becomes non-voluntary.
Exactly.
It becomes mandatory, it becomes forced. The second thing is historically what we have seen, and I'm saying this based on a number of cases that I have seen, of people detained under the Prevention of Terrorism Act. When the state has not had enough evidence or any evidence to indict a person, that is to start criminal proceedings against the person, but they still have suspicion or they don't want to let the person go, what they have done is they've tried to force the person to go to rehabilitation. Right? I know of a case where the wife said the husband was in detention. He called her to say, they had told him to call her and ask her because he refused to go. He called her and said, they're telling me if I go to rehabilitation, it'll be only for 1 year and they'll release me. What should I do? So the wife, she was very firm and said, you haven't done anything wrong. They don't have any evidence. We can fight this. Don't go. Don't agree to go for rehabilitation. He didn't actually agree. And what happened? They released him on bail. Then what happened? They discharged him. Right?
Yes.
So that shows historically that is what they have done. So even here, this Bureau of Rehabilitation Bill, which is supposed to apply only mainly to persons who are drug dependent, can also be used against any other person and in conjunction with the anti-terrorism law if they make it, if they enact it. Which is why I go back to my point of how people need to be concerned about every single repressive, regressive, anti-human rights piece of legislation because they're constructing, it's just another brick to construct this web of repressive laws. So I would say no, Sri Lanka has not been successful because we have seen drugs flooding the market, right?
Yes.
That has not decreased. The number of people using it appears to be increasing.
Yes.
We don't have proper treatment, which means the socio-economic, psychological impact on our society is terrible. It's taking a terrible toll. And all the best that the government can come up with it is throw people in prison and let's implement the death penalty. Seriously, it's quite farcical.
I want to talk to you about the death penalty, Ambika, because during President Maithripala Sirisena's time, he waged a massive war on drugs once more, and there were many crackdowns on drug peddlers, drug traffickers, whatnot. But the prospect of introducing death penalty for drug-related offences was met with mixed emotions, mixed sentiments from the people, and to date, it remains in the law books, although death penalty is not enacted in Sri Lanka currently. What is the danger of the death penalty for drug-related offences remaining in law books, although it is not enacted in Sri Lanka?
I mean, people believe that the death penalty is effective in controlling crime, but that's a myth. And it's a myth because now people say crime rates are increasing, but if you actually look at the police statistics, crime rates have gone down. So, but this is when the death penalty was not implemented,
Yes.
which means there really is no connection between the death penalty and crime level, right? That's the first point. Second, it's a very inhumane, cruel form of punishment. It is also irreversible. Now, we have seen no judicial system is infallible, and we have seen miscarriages of justice.
Yes.
We have seen mistakes being made. So what if you implement the death penalty, you take a life, and then you find out, I mean, in the United States alone, hundreds of people have been exonerated after years on death row. Even here, people who had, in high court have been given the death sentence. When they've appealed, they have been acquitted, right? So they found. So therefore, imagine if you implement the death sentence, what could possibly happen in that case? The other thing is, of course, if we want to create a humane society where violence is not the norm, where people do not take to or use violence to resolve problems, then it's also about not the states, how the states use violence. Because if the state uses violence liberally, if the state is inhumane, if taking a life is quite acceptable and normal, then what would stop people from doing that in their everyday lives?
Yes.
Right? You make
You're
cruelty
normalizing
normal.
killing.
Normalizing killing. You're desensitizing people to taking a life. How can that help us build a violence-free or crime-free or humane society? Where drug control is concerned, it also has a very practical negative impact, which is now to prevent drugs from coming into the country.
Right.
We are really dependent on intelligence from other countries.
Yes.
Intelligence and information sharing. Without that, it would be quite
Because
difficult.
it's a global network.
It's a global network, and without that, it would be really quite difficult.
Yes.
There are certain countries which, because of their internal laws and rules, they do not share information with countries where that country can lead to the conviction of a person and the person being sentenced to death. Not the conviction, but the person being sentenced to death. Which means right now that is a problem, right? Because for us, we do need this information. And by having the death penalty on our books, we have not resolved any problem. So why are we shutting down one avenue of possibly getting information that can prevent us, that help us prevent drugs from coming into the country, but we are not, we don't seem to care about that. So this is what I mean about the government not having an enlightened, practical, progressive approach to dealing with drugs.
I also want to talk to you about impunity when it comes to drug racketeers who are of large scale. We've seen people always alleging that the authorities only nab the small peddlers or the ones from the smaller communities who are merely the purchasers of drugs but not the drug dealers or the big fish in the sea. So what sort of steps can be taken by the authorities should they decide to go after those masterminds? Should they decide to go after the how can I say, the kingpins of the...
Exactly, the big traffickers.
Exactly, of those traffickers.
Yeah.
What sort of steps can be taken to arrest them, bring them before the law, and then uproot this drug menace from the root cause itself?
Firstly, yes, you are correct. What we do see, if you go to prison, what you'll see, the majority of people in prison are people who have been arrested for using drugs or having very small, what we
minimum
call
quantities.
User quantities.
Right.
Or they're people who sold drugs to fuel their own drug habit, which means they are very much at the bottom of the pyramid.
Yes.
They're very much at the bottom. But they're the ones who are being arrested, right? You do not, even the people on death row, people have this... people imagine, they think that most of the people on death row are people who are there for drugs. No, it's for murder. The number of people who are there for drugs is quite small. I think in 2020, only 2 people were sentenced to death for drug offenses.
Right.
Even then, what people need to know is this. They are not there for possessing massive quantities of drugs or trafficking. Because in Sri Lankan law, if you have more than 2 grams of heroin, cocaine, methamphetamine, now they brought that also in, then you can be sentenced to death.
Right.
2 grams
2
is
grams.
grams, not kilograms.
It's a very minimum amount.
Grams, right? So the people who you even arrest who have 2 grams of pure quantity heroin are not big-time dealers, they're not big-time traffickers, but they are the ones in prison.
Yes.
Time to ask the question, why? So it's the users who need to be given community support, who need to be given medical support,
Yes.
who need that kind of support, who are ending up in prisons. Now, if you look at, the big-time traffickers, etc., many of them have been extrajudicially killed in encounter killings, right?
We've seen them in the past.
Yeah, and you're like, what's going on there? Yeah. Why are they being killed? What's the reason for that? Now, I've also met many foreign nationals in prison for drug trafficking. So they've been from India, Pakistan, Afghanistan.
They've been arrested while transporting drugs.
Here, right? So when you talk to them, interesting story emerges. There's a pattern. They always say, so when they're most of them are first time, and they have taken to this trafficking due to some financial or family problem, economic issues, and they have been given false promises. They naively believe, the trafficker says, oh, don't worry, you won't get caught. Even if you get caught, we'll get you out. We'll get you out immediately. And these people totally believe that. They get caught. Once they get caught, what they have done is they've told the police who their contact is, who they're supposed to meet, because they're supposed to meet someone at a certain place, and they're also given that person's phone number. All that information they've given the police. But funnily enough, if you look at the case, if the indictment or the B report, you don't see anyone else other than this foreign national on that, which means although this person has given that information, the police haven't followed through, and they have not actually arrested the people at the top of the pyramid, which also raises questions about who is getting arrested, who's not getting arrested, why are these people getting arrested, why are certain people going away scot-free.
It goes to show that there is a stopgap in the pyramid somewhere.
Definitely, and also, this is not, once again, not just something to Sri Lanka, unique to Sri Lanka. In many parts of the world, we know that people who smuggle drugs, traffic drugs, that they cannot do it without the assistance of
international
people
players
in positions of power, people with political authority,
yes,
even people who are part of law enforcement or even the military. One of the questions I always ask, I don't say anything, I ask a question, which is, in the north, the military is ever present. So if, for instance, the families of the disappeared are organizing a protest, or a civil society organization is organizing some campaign, a few days before that, they will get a phone call asking, what's this? Why are you doing this? Who's going to turn up? Where are you going to? So clearly the intel is that good, right? They're getting that information. But how is it the military don't know who's bringing in drugs, where they're smuggling it from, and when it's coming? How come they don't know that, right? Though, shouldn't we be asking ourselves that question? So I think the way that while there are people who are I would call kingpins
Yeah.
or people doing this, the reason they're not getting arrested is that there are people clearly with links to people in positions of power, and also these big time drug smugglers or people allegedly smuggling drugs. These they have been extrajudicially killed in encounters after being arrested. We have seen that pattern in the last 2 years. Why have they been killed? Did they have information that could possibly get powerful people into trouble? If not, these killings took the same pattern. Or we took them out in the middle of the night without proper guards, without handcuffing them, in the dark to find weapons, and they suddenly somehow managed to try to wrestle our weapon and we had to shoot them. Doesn't that sound lame even to them? The fact that they repeat the same story again and again.
Yeah.
So I would say the reason the problem is perhaps not being addressed is because the people who have the power to address the problem are part of the problem.
Right. We were in conversation with Ambika Sadgunanathan on the prevention and control of drugs in Sri Lanka. We discussed how drugs can be controlled in adherence to human rights in Sri Lanka, and also certain caveats in the law and the legal framework and shortcomings in the legal framework that leads to infringements of human rights of persons who are arrested for drug-related offences. Unfortunately, we don't have any more time in the program for today. Thank you very much, Ambika, for joining me and enlightening me as well as our viewers on the state of drug control and prevention in Sri Lanka. That is all we have for the People's Platform today. Take care and have a great day.